Right, okay, well, yikes, thank you. So it's a privilege first to have been invited back again. I think it was May 2011, if I recall, that I kind of saw the outset of this journey. So it's a privilege to have been invited back and to see, how far you've travelled on the project. And, inevitably, I suppose, with big projects like this, it's clear that, some things have travelled further than others, and that's perhaps not entirely surprising. Having been told I had 10 minutes to to fill, I thought, right, okay, I better think about this over lunch. There's a lot, obviously, that one could say, and I've spoken at length on some individual things already, and I don't necessarily want to, repeat things I've already said. More general observations, and then I could comment on issues with some of the individual case studies in terms of relationships between them, if that's helpful, or that might be more appropriate to open that into the general discussion later. Perhaps we'll see. In terms of a sort of overview, I suppose the big debate that we had yesterday morning threw into sharp relief the fact that there are, different attitudes and different expectations among the group about, what a model is, what a simulation model is actually for. And to some extent, some of those issues then resurfaced again today when we were talking about the Gujarat model and, the sort of notion that all models are somehow wrong, but some are useful. And so it's quite instructive in a way to think about that spectrum of modeling, and we've already touched on this. The way I see it is that you've got models which can be largely intended for theory building, where you have a body of theory and you want to test, what could have happened in the past if your theories are correct. Not what did happen in the past, but what are the range of possible human behaviors that would follow from the theory that you've got. Then you've got, on the other hand, hypothesis testing models where you actually are asking the question, what were the processes that happened in the past to produce the archaeological record that we have surviving today? And then it occurred to me, thinking through this morning's conversation, that there's also, of course, the category where what you're really doing with your model is you're using it as a tool for thinking. And I hope this won't be taken in any offensive way, but it struck me at the moment, the Gujarat model, in a way, falls slightly into that category. Shout me down if I'm wrong, in the sense that we weren't presented with a very strongly defined set of theoretical expectations, nor a very specific data set that we would wish to compare outputs with. So in that sense, neither yet fully or strongly theory building nor hypothesis testing, but rather a model which, in the process of constructing it and finding out how to make it run and how to make the system not collapse and so on, it was acting as a tool which was then stimulating interests about, obviously the particular one that was pulled out this morning, was the importance of environmental variability. And that was something which, in a way, took a considerable degree, come out of the fact of doing the modeling process. Now, it strikes me that if one accepts that range, and clearly, we can argue this, but if for the moment you'll allow me to just assume that that's a reasonable description of the field of modeling, then, in a sense, why does it matter? Well, it matters for two reasons, I suppose. And one of them is you can't expect, obviously, the same things from all these models. And so it's hugely important that one is aware of which of these things you're trying to do, and that the model is then set up, and crucially, the experimental design is set up appropriately. Also, there's a question of scale. And my sense of the field and the literature as it is today is that theory-building models generally work best when they're dealing with, bodies of theory which will be of interest to a very wide segment of the community, of archaeologists, anthropologists, and others. That necessarily means that they're likely to operate at a level of generality, which means that there will always be people who find what they purport to show unsatisfactory for their particular case. But these are more about, sort of not general laws in in the old-fashioned 1970s sense. So not laws in the old-fashioned sort of strongly positivist sense necessarily, but some broad expectations about what goes on in human societies. But on the other hand, hypothesis testing models are actually generally hard to do at that scale, and you tend to have to drill down to a much more specific case study, because it's the only way you're ever going to get the quality of data in the main that actually will work for that. But the flip side of that is, don't expect everyone to be interested in your wonderful model that fits beautifully, because a large segment of the community just won't share your interest in, whichever bit of the world, or whichever time period in whichever bit of the world, make it even smaller, that you're desperately excited about. Other people won't. So there's a kind of, one has to have different expectations. And so this brings me then to the second reason that spectrum might matter, which is what you do about communicating modelling to a potentially skeptical, sometimes downright hostile, wider community. And I suppose this might be important as you go forward into the convergence phase in particular, and are thinking through what is the output, what is the result of SimulPast as this great collective enterprise, which is more than the sum of its individual parts. I mean, if the idea is that one should be able to say something about modelling in a more general sense, how many different messages do there need to be for different audiences? And so, for example, if you take a model which has been designed, I mean, I've already mentioned hypothesis testing models generally are less likely to have generality and therefore likely to reach a more limited audience, but equally, done well, they might be quite convincing, and archaeologists might really sit up and take note, go, oh, wow, yeah, actually that's really interesting, I believe that, because you've done this modelling well. If you take modelling as a tool for thinking with, my experience of this has been, actually, that's not a good idea. By the time you get to communicating outside your own research group, you need to be presenting it as a theory building exercise or a hypothesis testing exercise. Other people don't care how you thought it all up and how you got there. That may be deeply interesting to those involved in the research, and in particular, where there's a computer science dimension, which is important. So if you take the Gujarat case study, the idea of building agents who can actually make predictions about what other agents are predicting, in other words, having agents with theory of mind, which is one of the things I understood is an interest, I know that to be a very live and serious research agenda within computer science. Now, that would suggest that talking about the detail of that in a computer science type of audience is going to work much better than sort of working your way through that to an archaeological audience, who are constantly potentially going to be thinking, yeah, right, lovely, I mean, humans have theory of mind, that's the whole debate, is do chimps? We don't know, but we know humans do. So you are struggling to make your, it doesn't sort of sound like the right kind of problem to have, however intrinsically interesting it is in certain domains. So my point there is that when it comes to communication of the outputs from these different projects, it's likely that they're going to have to be quite carefully targeted in different journals, in different venues, in different ways, and sometimes it will be appropriate to foreground some particular body of theory that one's playing with. Sometimes it will be appropriate to foreground a very specific archaeological case study where you want to test a hypothesis, and sometimes it's more appropriate to be talking in a multidisciplinary audience about the integration of new computing technologies, say, and then that would make it more appropriate to explain why modelling theory of mind could have a real differential result on a simulation output. So I suppose there's that point about communication. There are some other things that perhaps come out of this. I mean, in more practical terms, depending whether one's building models to explore theory or to test hypotheses, there are, it seems to me, some critical things, such as, and crucially, experimental design and what you parameterize and what you don't parameterize. And we've seen some different approaches over the last couple of days. If, for example, you take the issue of cooperation, and I'm thinking so about the Patagonia and Terra del Fuego models, we've seen one model where, on the one hand, the sensitivity to cooperation was not parameterized. It was something that, that was parameterized, actually, wasn't it? But then you looked at how that changed the impact. In another case, we had the question of, I think it was intolerance. And again, so there's an interesting question there about whether you want those things to be variables that you change through multiple runs of the model, or whether you want to allow them to emerge, whether you actually don't want to parameterize them at all, but you want them to be an emergent output. And you could play both of those models differently. They are parameterized, as I understand it, at the moment, but you could play it a different way, depending really whether you're interested in the evolution of that thing, or what happens under particular scenarios. So experimental design and what you parameterize is crucial. Validation. We've heard a lot about validation, particularly yesterday and yesterday afternoon. And of course, the one thing there which struck me was it's very important to bear in mind that different people seem to use that word validation quite differently. To me, validation means looking to see whether your model is plausible before you test it for your hypothesis testing. So in other words, you can't validate a model with the same data as the data that you're going to test against in a hypothesis testing sense. And sometimes that comes across very clearly that people are not doing that, and other times, and it can be a communication thing, sometimes more than anything real, or it might be real, it's not so clear that there are actually two independent things going on there. And certainly my understanding of validation would be that this must be a separate process. I think I'll stop there because I've probably run out of time, and I can throw in some thoughts about individual projects as we go through them, and I know Charlie and others got other things to add. So,
thank you. So maybe we just continue with the next.
Great. Thank you. So obviously, great. Thanks for inviting me here this time. I'm sorry I missed the first round, as it were, a year ago, and this has been extremely interesting and informative, indeed, for many of the types of projects that I'm involved with myself. But with my archaeological hat on, I guess I have to echo quite a few of the things that Mark was saying. And I guess, for most of my archaeological colleagues, I think I can quite happily say a lot of people just see modeling as representational, a visual representation of data. Whereas a lot of things we've seen today and yesterday are theoretical model building. And I think that's a much smaller niche of interest in the broader archaeological world. And Mark's right, I think I hit the nail on the head, that they want to see that there's a value in that. So I think they want to see those theoretical models that are actually have got an underlying thread that is hypothesis testing, so that it isn't just a computerized exercise, as it were, but is always being driven by some possible archaeological explanation, which you're trying to see perhaps in a different way. And what's really crucial, I think, is those parameters, the criteria that you're using to build any of those models are probably often quite small sets of data, or not too many of them in a stack, as it were, and probably also spatially often probably need to be quite limited. So for example, the Patagonian Terra del Fuego example probably works better for me in the sense of tackling an individual problem in a relatively similar constrained landscape, whereas what we saw yesterday, those dynamics of the explosion of agricultural across the whole of Europe, are a much harder thing, I think, for people to actually say, well, what's my niche in southeastern France within that bigger picture? They'd want to see absolute data from southeastern France with actually related it to possible archaeological models of exploitation within the early Neolithic. And I think, to me, that's your best selling point. You may have to subset out some very particular sets of the model data and model hypotheses and possible model results so that you can be convergent to a broader archaeological audience. I think it's be very crucial in that reporting stage that you're not seen to be answering all things to all men, as it were. But there's certain things you can say, well, if I have that layer cake of data in this particular place, with this background set of archaeological theory and hypotheses behind us, we can actually contribute properly to the archaeological or landscape archaeological development debate, as it were. And so that, scales of resolution, I think, is all really. And as most of you know, actually deal any field project, actually getting the level of data you need to create those parameterized data sets to actually build a model is extremely difficult, I think, to get in the detail that you really need to be able to say something that might be plausible in a real world. And that's something I'll talk a little bit about in my talk later this afternoon. But I think these things can be complementary, but I think you need to be really sort of constrained and specific often in what you're trying to attempt out of these broader model systems that we've actually seen over the last couple of days.
Okay, thank you. So let's go to our third reviewer, Jordi. Jerry.
Okay, so, well, first of all, also thank you for allowing me to be here. So you know that I am a supporter of this kind of projects that are really multidisciplinary, and I think that that's the way to go. So I will just give some feelings that I had, and also some reaction to some comments that you, because probably this is the advantage of having people coming from different fields, because probably we feel that the purpose of the project is completely different, and that's nice, and that is the. So, okay, you know my background, so I'm coming from computer science. I'm coming from this cognitive perspective of things and this theory of mind and all this stuff. Okay, so probably my perspective is biased towards that direction, so you just take my comments from the part that you...
With a pinch of salt.
Yes, with a pinch of salt. Okay, so just let me say that first, just as a reaction a little bit of some comments, is that I think that the SimulPast project, as it has been, has two elements. So I mean, you have two different kind of people participating in this project, let's say, and to put this thesis. So people from archaeology, anthropology that have theories and they want to see results about those theories and demonstrate that those theories are really like they are. But there is also the people that come from the technical perspective, people from AI, people from physics, people from the simulation, traditional simulation, that want to advance also in that direction. So I think that you have to have in mind that at the end, SimulPast is not only just a set of theories from archaeology and anthropology that are being demonstrated or tested, but also there is some advance in the technology that allows you to evaluate these theories, okay? And this is perhaps somehow, always from my perspective, as a technician, something that I lack here in the project. So it seems that technology in the project is just the tool that we're using to, let me put it here, make happy the archaeologists and the anthropologists. And should not be like that. So with the help of the ideas that archaeologists and the domains that the archaeologists and anthropologists have, is a marvelous opportunity in order to improve the technology to analyze these domains, okay? So it's something that it should be in mind that also this is a criticism for the technicians in the project, because they cannot just limit it to apply what they know that it works. We cannot repeat the Anasazi simulation once and over. This was in the 70s was okay, but now probably, yeah, it works, and yeah, but we know it works. So here we are not advancing, okay? So we have to try new things, we have to explore new approaches, and this advance is also benefiting both parts, okay? So let me say something that I think is really positive, and a few months ago, I had the opportunity to review a document that you sent me about the project, okay? So one of my criticisms at that moment, it was that reading that document, it was like archaeologists and anthropologists were here, and technicians were here. There was no communication. The questions that the people from archaeology and anthropology was doing was not connected with the reality of the technology and what technology can offer. Now I've seen that this channel is already there and is starting to work. So I've seen that the questions are more real according to the technology we have. Although, again, I see that I think that these questions have to go a little bit beyond to allow the technicians to advance also in the technology, not just using what we know it works or what we know it has been tested before, but trying to advance in the direction of technology. And in this sense, just to finish, is of course I see the technology here as something that is transversal to all the case studies. And at some moment, it seems that like if because I was assigned this dance partner, the only way I can dance is like this. So if the people that I'm collaborating is doing equation-based models, so this is the only, in that case study, I only will explore that. I think that yesterday, I think it was you that was commenting, have you tried agent-based models also and compare I think that this is nice. I mean, I know that you cannot do that, okay, in all the case studies, because this is a lot of work and the resources are limited. But trying to go to that ideal world where you can explore, because you have all those technologies there, with people is expert there in these technologies, so you can use that in order to try to approach the case studies from different perspectives and see if one perspective is better than the other, and not just because by chance you just put together these two people working together, this is the only path that I will explore. So that's I think that. And then just finally, a final comment is that it has to be when you put the scientific questions from the point of view of archaeologists and anthropologists, you have to be aware of what technology can offer just to avoid going beyond. But at the same time, people from technology has to be able to transmit what is possible and can be possible in the future, in the near future. So at the end, you keep this balance between where we can go, the questions we are making, okay? Just to avoid questions that are too esoteric, let's say, and that now cannot be afforded with the technology in the next 15 years, but trying also to avoid this the idea of, okay, this is what works, so I cannot offer nothing else, just make me questions that I can answer now. No, we want to answer this in 3-4 years, okay? So, well, that's all.
Well, thank you, the three of you, for your insightful comments. If I may, I'll just read some of the words I have been writing, like key topics that I think are common to the discussion in the last 2 days and that they have been brought up here. And then after that, I think we just open it for comments. It could be related to specific case studies, although I think we have covered most of this after the discussion every day. So it will be, it can be to specific case studies, but it will be nicer if we can try to broaden and try to bring some more overarching topics. And I think some of the things that have come out is first a model for what? No, are we all modeling for the same thing? This theory, building, testing hypothesis, no? Another issue that has come up and that Mark has pointed, this thing of what has to be parameterized and how we experiment with the models, bringing things in, taking things out, and what can we learn from that. The issue of validation, of course. The issues of scales that Charlie have pointed. And finally, this last issue that Jordi was talking about, this dialogue between theory and the technology. How can we move both fields? How can technology push theory and theory push technological development? These are some of the issues they have brought. You are, of course, free to raise new issues. And yeah, Ash, you want to start? Yes, please.
With not an answer, but maybe a little bit of an explanation, especially onto what Jordi has seen in terms of change, the respect of the document you all received at the beginning and what we have in here now. And especially the fact that the project doesn't really want to see a technical side and a anthropology, archaeology side, a humanities or whatever side in that sense. And indeed that was one of the points that I made when I opened this workshop, in the sense that for me, and I guess for most of us, it's exactly going beyond that situation in which we have somehow a divide, a border, like in the Oasis case studies, in which we have a reality on one side and a reality on the other side, and then there is a point in which the two reality exchange some information and discuss something, and then they jump back into their own realities, and do something. And I will see this actually fundamentally a failure of the project. And the point, and I like the fact that in any case, this is coming out already from what you saw from the outside, that we are effectively moving from something that is discussing with two words that they get together discussing, and trying to get this becoming effectively one word that can make a common discussion. And indeed, I think that's one of the push, and it's one of the push also behind this convergence thing that seems to have been also interpreted as sometimes a kind of a squashing diversity, which is not. And indeed, we saw that the project has inside a lot of diversity, has a diversity in terms of theoretical view, has a diversity in terms of how these problems were approached, has a diversity in terms of what we think, are best practice to reach certain objective. And I think that this diversity is, one of the strengths, one of the incredible strengths of the project, and then that is possible to have it only with project of this level. And therefore, the convergence that we, is thought about is not a homogenization of the situation, but is effectively the fact of being able to talk together, not from different sides, and finding a common path in which we all feel comfortable, and in which, on one side we don't feel technicians or technical supplier, and on the other side we don't feel archaeologists that they want to replicate a reality, and in which we will never, in a sense, reach that level. Or if we reach it, in any case, we already have what we call reality, so what we want to replicate it for. If we don't understanding as it is, it's not much use of having another one that is the same. So in that sense, I'm pleased that is coming out this kind of perspective, and indeed, I agree that there is, and I think that that's exactly, in a sense, probably the various backgrounds representing the people working in the project. There are, fundamentally, sometimes fundamentally different views on what, we are supposed to do with these things. And if, on one side, this could be quite a pull, in the sense that it's difficult to move forward because, when you start to have people. But on the other side is also an important thing, because it gives us all the time a kind of a reality check in terms of what we are doing. And, it's very easy in a situation like this, overseeing things and get into your path and keep going, and you keep, you take up speed, and that speed takes you farther. And it's nice when there is somebody that say, hey, sorry, slow down a bit, and maybe you didn't think about this, and then maybe that's something important that you might have to consider. So that's, it's, I think it's part of the richness of the project. So just to, I stop in here too, it was just, a kind of a hat on what you three have started introducing. And as Vicky was saying, it would be nice now to see what, what are the feeling of the various people that has been here for 2 days, and what, we can think for the next step. I see that.
Oh, sorry, yes.
A question mainly to Mark, that was who raised this issue. So basically, these computational tools and simulations, so in some sense, you presented as an option, either as tools for thought or as hypothesis testing. What about a virtual lab? Okay, so we all know the Sims game. So think about a lab, a virtual lab, where you can drop people, okay, and see the dynamics, okay, and wouldn't that be of, I'm asking because I'm not archaeologist, not anthropologist, I'm coming from the computer science point. So a virtual lab will not certain type, given certain properties. Wouldn't that be interesting from analyzing sort of time scale behaviors, okay, of these virtual people, if these people capture some of the right features?
Okay, I mean, you missed. I came up with 3 categories: theory building, and hypothesis testing, and tools to think with. And I guess, if I understand what you're suggesting properly, that would have been in my theory building category of dropping people in and finding out, what are the range of possibilities under different circumstances. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But my point there was simply that don't expect all archaeologists or anthropologists to get particularly excited by that, which doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it's a question of picking what you communicate to whom, and that was my real point about the computer science development as well, is that there are places where that dialogue can happen, and there are places where that dialogue can be reported, and you can expect it to generate interest and excitement, and there are other places where you can report that and it's not going to work. And I'm sure in the same way that if I walked into a computer science conference and started, I don't know, talking about something to do with the finer points of retouch on Mesolithic flint artifacts, it just might send the people in the back row to sleep, and so it's a question of, the point is simply communication strategies. The project as a whole can be embracing these things. One has to think carefully about what, which bits are, how to, in other words, it's a question of the tactics of how you build multidisciplinarity, and you can't expect everyone overnight to just think this is fabulous. You've got to show in their own terms why it was worthwhile to them, what they take away from it. Then you begin to draw people in, and then a larger pool of people can start to participate in a... So I think I was thinking of it as a tactical issue.
I completely agree that, your discourse in one kind of conference or another would be different. Even if the research is whole, okay, but then the way you present, of course, when you go to talk with archaeologists, it was 2 years ago that I went to this computer and archaeology conference, that their archaeologists that are there are supposed to be, let's say, inclined to accept computer science, and of course, the kind of dialogue that you can establish there is completely different than when I'm going to the multi-agent system conference, okay, where I have there people that is in the hard part of multi-agent systems. So the dialogue, I agree that this is also a strategical thing. You cannot explain things in the same way in the different fields, because you have to put this research in a way that the others can accept. You can put always a stone just to make it a little bit more. So, but of course, it has to be quite smooth. I completely agree with that.
So speaking from some of the keywords that Vicky was suggesting, and then asking for some feedback from the reviewers. We have a deadline soon, which is the production of these journal papers, which is a way of discussing on a real world ground what you are discussing on a more general level. And I was wondering whether we could define, for some case studies like Tierra del Fuego, I think a nicely close work, simple, but with an application could be, as Mark was suggesting, to try the model you've been elaborating in 2 different coastlines, a straight one and a more fractal-like one. And then I guess that could be relevant to archaeologists interested in the region, and at the same time to modelers or people more interested into the method of thing. For Gujarat, what we said this morning, maybe work on the stress, work on stressing the model we have. This is to get something close in the short term that can be interesting to the 2 kind of audiences we are considering. So stress the climate, but at the same time apply this stress to the 3 different kind of agents as we have them, and this could be interesting maybe in the 2 sides. For the neolithization, I'm thinking of the work that Kim was presenting yesterday. I think the exploring the peripheries, so this is more a problem of scale. Exploring the detail at the periphery of the European diffusion model seems to be something that has an interest both as an answer to archaeology, support for archaeological theory, and functionality of these models at the smaller scale, which is another of the. So I was thinking maybe, trying to get some feedback to try and help each case study get to a close work in a short term, based on the work that has been done so far, and try to pinpoint, which variables could be, or which extra work is needed to get a nice work that is interesting to the different communities involved.
I will like. Oh, yes. No. Yeah, sure.
Well, okay. So you're asking for a personal shopping list.
Fundamentally what he's doing. Yes.
Well, since you've asked me, it won't be arrogant of me to give one, will it? I hope. Okay, so I mean, sort of semi off the top of my head, and with the caveat that I simply don't know, the detail of the case studies and the background, current state of research, and obviously, therefore, might come up with things which really are not sensible. But well, let's think. So thinking about yesterday, what did we start with? The cooperation models, wasn't it? I mean, as you say, it struck me that with the Tierra del Fuego model, but we discussed this yesterday, that there was a suggestion that the spatial dimension wasn't very interesting, and my reading of that model was actually the spatial dimension's hugely interesting, both actually from a theoretical point of view in terms of the current resurgence of interest in spatial analysis in archaeology, for example, but potentially also in terms of more fine-grained, although having been talking about the detail of that archaeological record in the pub last night, I can see that there are some issues with touching base with the data set, but nevertheless, one might, at a very coarse-grained level of differentiating between different types of coastline, be able to explore something there. With the other one in the cooperation cluster, which was the Patagonia model, I don't know. I suppose that model at the moment, if I understood correctly, is set up really to explore if you have certain tendencies towards intolerance that was parameterized, then to what extent, in terms of economic exchange, do you drive people apart or bring them together? I guess my temptation would have been not to parameterize intolerance, but to see if that could somehow evolve. But that's because I think I would be coming from a different research background, more in cognitive ethology and human evolution and the evolution of human cognition, rather than a more, perhaps materialist-based, exchange-based kind of perspective. So that, I think, is a case of where you're coming from, perhaps in terms of research traditions, would lead you to choose to parameterize things differently, because actually your underpinning questions different. So, that's probably a sort of difference of starting point, if you like. Then next we went to, was it yesterday afternoon, was the transmission models, wasn't it? So, well, my thoughts on the spread of agriculture, which is, seems to me that a really fun thing, and again, this has just come up a moment ago, there would be to see if, given that the reaction diffusion models are well and truly out there, well published, this is a big body of work, the real kind of value added, or the real benefit of having that project associated or part of SimulPast, seemed to me, would be exactly this question of, okay, well, if you did it as an agent-based model, what would be different? What would you be modelling that was different? Are the results the same? Are they different? Why are they the same? Why are they different? Is it to do with spatial scales? Is it to do with small population sizes being differentially, different modelling approaches being sensitive? That strikes me as a really interesting and productive area to explore. And then today has come up the issue of scale there, and looking on the one hand at the continental wide scale, on the other hand, Iberia, and is one approach more appropriate at one scale or not? It seems like a very rich area for some quite interesting, to some extent, methodological investigation as much as anything. With the obsidian, the other one was the exchange of obsidian, wasn't it? I suppose my shopping list there would be a slightly clearer understanding of what the underpinning model is, that's actually a conceptual model that's intended to be implemented. So I understood that you have an interesting tension in that model between a problem which on the one hand seems to lend itself to network analysis rather well, but on the other hand a desire to push against an older archaeological model, the fall-off curve, which is based on continuous space. And there's a sort of interesting tension there between, you know, a continuous space approach to modelling on the one hand and something grounded in networks. Now, you know, I wonder whether there's an opportunity to foreground that a bit and actually more explicitly discuss that tension and, you know, the kind of issues that arise when you want to deal with a model that's characterised in one form, but somehow you think your data is actually better expressed in the other form. How do you do that? How do you move between a network representation and continuous surface representation? What are the pitfalls of doing that? What are the different approaches you might take? So that struck me as one thing that was kind of interesting there. And then there were the different, I think you had 5 different possible modifications of the random walk, if I remember correctly. I wasn't clear, and I didn't kind of get round to asking the question about what anthropological or archaeological interpretation actually fell on each of those 5, and therefore why specifically it was worth you know, trying them. But I mean, you know, that's just a clarification thing. And then today, of course, we had the where were we? Resilience, wasn't it? With the Gujarat one, I mean, well, I mean, again, I've already made some suggestions about things one can look at in terms of amplitude, frequency, and a moving mean of long-term climate change would be one way to go. Looking at frequencies of cultural transmission and how that interacts with different rates of environmental change would be another kind of question. A third kind of question, which actually had a very interesting discussion over lunch about on a more sort of ethnographic scale, would be in fact not to set the model up at all with agro-pastoralists and hunter-gatherers, but to think about the literature of societies where we know ethnographically that people actually move to some extent between strategies and back over certain time frames. And so, in a very simplistic sense, this is probably, I mean, off the top of my head, you know, scale of 0 to 10. If you're 10, you're 100% dependent on hunter-gatherer products. If you're at 10, sorry, did I say 10? If you're at 0, you're 100% on hunter-gatherer products. If you're at 10, you're 100% dependent on whatever the agro-pastoral products are. And then 2 variants of that model, one where the decision-making that your agents do, and this might then be interesting again from the computer science research end of it, have meta decision-making, so strategy choice. So not just having them make choices according to fixed variables, but actually having them change their strategy at a higher level. So they can actually choose, actually, I think I'm going to start incorporating some hunter-gatherer products into my agro-pastoralist diet, or vice versa. So allowing people to have mixed strategies and then seeing what happens. Do you get the population converge towards mixed strategies? Does it get bipolar, so that, you know, hunter-gatherers or agro-pastoralists? Does one win out at the expense of the other? Is it resilient if you do that, if one wins out, if you inject some noise by forcibly making a few hunter-gatherers every now and then, for example, if they've all become agro-pastoralists? Does that provide the evolutionary drive that provides resilience in the context of rapid climate change? You know, sometimes it's good to have some people doing something that is temporarily actually maladaptive. Mm-hmm. That'd be one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it would be to have, not to allow mixed strategies, but to have some trading relationship between them. So agro-pastoralists can, I don't know, get skins or something from hunter-gatherers and, you know, something like this. And in that case, one might, hypothetically I suppose, imagine that you'd be much less likely to get mixed strategies and more likely to see a stable equilibrium or some sort of periodic equilibrium where actually you tend to maintain the bipolar thing much more, and maybe that then has more evolutionary drive, and maybe it's more resilient in the face of rapid climate change because both strategies remain present in the population. I mean, that's just 2 ways that you could, you know, take that model, which I just struck me, you know, we had an interesting conversation over lunch about this. Could be a really interesting way to go. On the other one, the Oasis construction. Yeah, I don't know. I found that an interesting model, actually. I was interested by the way in which the immigration factor was apparently so important in the sensitivity of that model. I haven't quite got my head around that in terms of adding anything to my shopping list. I think I better stop, 'cause it's getting expensive.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're going to keep you in the project. All these ideas you're providing. Very nice.
Great privilege.
Any reactions, comments?
And I guess, well, the resilience model for Gujarat could go the other way. It could be more environmental drivers, which are constraining the people movement. Is another way of actually approaching it, but we're just adding to your expensive shopping list.
We get the
Yeah.
check and then we see how much money we have. And we leave there what we can.
Just out of curiosity, Marco and Andrea, for Gujarat, I mean, how good is the actual archaeological resolution of sites on the ground in relation to the sand dune systems, for example?
The resolution of
actual sites and date ranges and.
Should I? Date ranges is bad. I mean, is a lot of guesswork based on 4 sites that have radiocarbon dates. As for distribution, much better. Although the typology is based on very classical approach, microliths, pottery. There is a lot of mixture which is not really understood. But the positioning, I mean, we are using a very small area. It's a few. Well, I mean, in the model is 600 square feet. Well, I don't remember, but it's not too big, and it's very homogeneous climatically and environmentally. Site positioning is pretty. I mean, it's very accurate, and for that area, all that there is more or less on the map. All that is visible. We've been exploring the interdunes, cuts. Well, you've been there. Any exposed profile, and we find no archaeology there. So this is. We've been taking into account possible post-deposition processes or obliteration of the archaeological record, and in that sense, the model we're using, the settlement is only on dunes. Biomass or resources are only in the interdune. These are quite sound assumptions on what we know, based on what we know. And surface survey for archaeology has been going on for tens of years now, and the knowledge of that is pretty accurate. And we have, I mean, there are a few new sites, key sites, either only microliths, so just hunter-gatherers, or just, I mean, we're pinning out for excavation sites that will become kind of reference for one period or one strategy or the other rather than period, because so far they've been excavating mixed sites, which, because it's open air, it brings a lot of issues. So what we're trying to do, the strategy is to pin down the chronology of the 2 different strategies, and then we'll have to derive datings from that to the rest of the surfaces, and this is our limit in the validation process.
So sounds like it could be achievable then to.
With some caveats.
No more comments. I have a question for the people who are more in the technological side, and my question is: do you feel pushed by the theory to do new? Well, it doesn't have to. you represent. Just taking on the comment that Jordi was saying, no, how we anthropologists, archaeology are trying to push our theories or to test and play with them. But so my question is, do you think that you feel also pushed to think in a different way, or what can we do within the context of the project to push this other side or to give more room if you don't feel like push?
Yeah, I will answer first. In my opinion, but I think that it's my opinion in the sense that I am in a case study. We are pushing the sense that we have a question or a goal that is exciting for everywhere in the case study. I mean, when Mark was saying about what he was saying about this thing of not having an agent, a hunter-gatherer or an agropastoral agent, but have an agent with different actions and depending on what is going on in the environment, the agent chooses one or the other action and chooses a lifestyle or the other one. It's really interesting also from the technical point of view, because we're introducing this smart agent that can do that without us interfering too much in the way it behaves. So it's really, really interesting. And in this sense, the challenge that we were talking with Hector is that usually you don't see this type of models in computer science. So it's extremely interesting in this regard. On the other hand, there's a technical challenge because if you want this kind of simulations, you need tools that are not exactly there. So, for example, an agent-based model that can use a cluster of computers is, I mean, when we began the project, there were no platforms that could be executed in a high-performance computing infrastructure. So we started one, now there's another one, RIPAS HPC. There are differences in the sense that ours is more focused on we want to use this computing capability to improve the artificial intelligence of the agent, the theory of mind, or the decision-making process. You can also have another one that is, okay, I want to execute simulations with 1 million agents. I think that with archaeology, usually you don't need this kind of thing. But the other thing, it's pretty interesting. So the project is pushing us to create the tools to do that and to develop not only the technical, but also the theoretical things that we need to do that. I think, I don't know if Hector would agree or... Okay. I don't know if...
Well, in my case, I don't think that's a kind of question for me because, well, maybe in this context, we seem like technicians, but we don't really think like that we are. So, because, well, in terms of computer science, there are plenty of people here that know much more than us, and maybe they can push the technologies and etc. But in our case, well, there is an intermediate role between archaeology and computer science, and it's the role of modeling. So it's how to make the abstraction. Well, and sometimes there is a direct path between the archaeologists, anthropologists, etc., and the computer scientists. But we think that our work is in the middle. In the middle is how to begin from a theory and how to formalize that. And when you have that formalized, you have to implement that in a computer. So if the question is if I feel pushed in terms of formalizing, yes, I really feel that. But it's difficult to discuss that, to say, well, we have advanced in modeling because, well, what we have is just a cycle. Well, that is what I need, that is my goal. No, you can update on goal. That is what we have. Those are the tools that we have in modeling. Those are the frameworks. Those are the different things. So, well, really, for the question, yes, I really feel pushed, but I think that it's very difficult for me to explain that in, well, those are the best guidelines for modeling for others. I don't feel comfortable trying to teach others what's the input that we are doing here. So, well, there is a third role that is modeling, and maybe we have improved. Well, in terms of other thing that Marco has said, that it's, well, in the next step is convergence. Well, in terms of practical issues for an engineer like me, well, we are beginning from different case studies, from different questions. Well, the only thing that we can make convergence is in terms of modeling. In the rest of the terms, well, how can we do that? have are very heterogeneous. The approaches are heterogeneous. Well, the questions, the backgrounds. So in terms of questions, it's impossible for us to converge. So the only, under my point of view, well, you can answer me right now, but the only thing that I see is the point that where we can push all the group together is, well, what we have learned in modeling, just in modeling.
But I think that that's exactly the point, in the sense that, and that's why, for instance, there has been a strong push in formalizing the models and work quite heavily on that side in this period. But because indeed, it would be, in a sense, unreal to try to push, so different background into something in which we want or we have to fit, by default or because we are obliged to do. But if we all recall, one of the specific objective of the project is to reach the end of a 5-year path with fundamentally being able, for instance, to suggest best practice to do modeling and simulation. And I think, for instance, this is one of the points where we should be able to converge, where we should be able to say something together, and together in the sense as a project, not as a case study, as a cluster or thing like that. Because these are, from my perspective, the points where we can really contribute from all our expertise and experience we gain in the project. So in that sense, yes, I think that was a good point to explicitate in this perspective, and in the technical part.
But I don't think, from my perspective, that you have to converge. Because if you converge, it means that all of you think the same, and that's not good. And then it's not multidisciplinary. So I think that more than convergence is that you understand, to a certain point, what the other can do, or what the other wants, and what the other can offer, and use that, exploiting this from your perspective. That probably you have a more knowledge about that area, so you can exploit that in a way that the other cannot, and the other way around. So more than a convergence and unifying thinking, let's say, no, let's exploit the different thinking that you have in the project. At least is how I see that. But of course, to do that, you need to understand the other, and then this dialogue is, it's essential. And
no, of course, what I'm discussing is what's the meaning of convergence for us. That's the point. So that's the point. So, and I don't think that, I'm completely agree with you. I don't think that convergence is to make the same. What I wanted to stress is convergence is to learn from the other activities, to learn to model everything as together. I think that it's the only convergence point that we can do. So the only point that we wanted to stress is that.
Okay, I think that the debate is now finally reaching some excitement, and we want to hear Bernardo, and okay, I don't know who was first. Is a reaction to that?
Yeah, it's in that direction. Yeah.
Yours also? Oh.
So, what I would like to highlight is that we are talking about 5-year project. So we are at 1/3 of the project, and personally I'm very happy because I remember when we started, and the impression I had is just speak very different languages, and I remember our first reading group discussing what is model. And I'm quite happy with the results we presented. Everybody starting speaking a sort of common language, and I think that is good. So the idea of the project, if I understand how we are developing the project, is okay. We use the case study as an opportunity to developing a different way of thinking in our problem. And after we move to a first sort of convergence, but because we are 11 groups of research, and particularly different in several aspects, because you know perfectly that also within the same group of archaeology, we have different theoretical approach. So, and this is a challenge for me. But this is the reason why we decided to create 3 clusters. And we are just starting now the cluster. So this is the first moment of a sort of convergence, forcing us in discussing within the people of our cluster a sort of not common point of view, but at least the same language. And after that, we should move to something. We use the word convergence. I don't know if it's the good word, we can change it. But the idea is not do exactly the same, but try to do something in a different way. So this, for me, was the challenge of the project. And personally, I think that as an archaeologist by training, I don't want to finish the project with the same archaeological approach, because otherwise it doesn't work. So, but doesn't mean that I have to convince all the archaeology that this is the good way of do. But for me, just as the good word is the virtual laboratory. So it's the idea to experiment. And in the three cluster is pretty evident that we have also different way of approach from a theoretical point of view, from technical point of view. And I think in the next 2 years, because we are talking about 2 years of cluster, we have to experiment this sort of convergence. And I hope that at the end of these 2 years of cluster convergence, we can provide something to the general discussion in how we have to work in modeling or developing technical things, taking in account that the final aim of the project is a sort of best practice methodological guideline for, maybe for everybody is too much, but for the majority of the people involved in the project. So this is what my feeling. Thanks.
I have more or less the same feeling as Bernardo. In fact, yes, my feeling has been that we archaeologists, we have changed our questions to adapt to technology, and not that technology has been forced to solve our questions. Probably because it was much more important that we change our informal and too much verbal way of posing questions, because probably the traditional questions in archaeology and anthropology are the wrong questions, because they are traditionally exposed in completely, not unfashionable, but absolutely unexpressible languages. And when we begin to discuss with technicians, with modeling engineers, thank you very much for the word, we began to think. And I think that there is more, it has been, up to now, much more change from archaeologists, anthropologists from the point of view than from the technicians. Of course, you are doing new tools, but we are waiting for using these new tools that you are producing, and then all the members of the team can use this approach. Hopefully, we can create this kind of virtual lab, as Hector say, it will be wonderful, but probably it will be the subject of next pseudo-consolidator or something like that, because for the moment, convergence is just discussing and how different archaeological, anthropological questions began to be transformed into, at first, the same modeling language. Then we accept the variability of approaches, and we began to create the new language. I think one thing I have learned in the very last months is that the ODD approach is horrible. It doesn't work. It doesn't work as a way of communicating between us. So probably we have to look for another thing. And ODD now is fashionable in this agent-based modeling. That's something that we are discovering when we are trying to use this approach. And we need a kind of intermediate language between the language of exactly technicians, if you want, just the algorithmic language, and the language in which we are expressing the archaeological questions. And yeah, we need the example of our modeling engineers and technicians be converted into modeling engineers, and not only on the tools. But of course, that means that we archaeologists, we should also learn a bit of technician. And if we accepting that technicians are more or less understanding our language, we should make an effort to understand the language of the technicians. Doesn't mean that I don't want to program exactly, but I have to know enough programming for understanding the limitations of the technique.
Just a reaction that I had. No, because somehow it's a little bit paradigmatic, and especially I would put you in the middle between technicians and archaeologists, which is just like a bridge between both. Okay, but at some moment you said we are waiting for the tools to be ready to use these tools, and I think that should not be the approach. The approach should be I will participate with you in building these tools, because at the end, who has to use the tool is you. So you have to participate in building, because if not, what will happen is that what happens in other areas, that computer scientists start to build tools that, from the point of view of computer scientists, are fantastic, but then when the real user wants to use that tool, says, oh, come on, but this is not what we want. I mean, it's not the kind of questions that this tool is answering, questions that I don't matter. I mean, so I think that is where you have to find this way of participating in the technological development. Of course, at the end, who has to write the code will be a computer scientist. But with the influence of in this case, the archaeologists and anthropologists that say, okay, come on, no, this is what you are doing. I mean, this is not useful, or this will never go in the direction that I want. And this dialogue between both is what makes a tool really useful, okay, at the end. But, well, just...
Okay, so we need not a theory of mind, but a convergence of minds in this sense. Yeah, Bernardo.
I think that one really, for me, very, very important aspect between the many Mark suggested, and really thank you, because it's incredibly helpful. Thank you for you, but the concept of the problem of the communication. So because how you can communicate something that you don't know. So this is the reason why, so I remember, so when we started working the case study, and it's not a problem of only just the language, but also a problem of semantic, you know, and what we are experimenting is, okay, now we understand a little bit more of how it works. And now we have to start thinking how we have to communicate this to also the other people of the project, and thinking in our own community, because, you know, a scientific community works in this way. I don't like it personally, but we have discipline, we have a group of researchers, we have humanities, social scientists, art science. So we are not going to change it now, I suppose. Could be very good, but this is probably difficult for the moment. So, but I think that we have to absolutely consider how we can communicate what we are doing to our own community. And this is a work that is really, really important. And otherwise, it's not a problem of convince them, but at least communicate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's have the last intervention.
Yeah, one thing that first of all, the framework that we have developed is already published and it's free software. And I suppose that in the next month we will have a tutorial about how to use it. But I have a question about when you say that you need new tools. When you say that you need that you need new tools, what are you what are you thinking? I mean, the model, for example, of Patagonia uses NetLogo. What is the problem of NetLogo that you think that we need other tools to use? Because it's really interesting for us to see which requirements of the archaeologists are not. I mean, why the current programs are software is not suited for these questions, and the same for ODD, I think. And I completely agree with him that we need your support in order to advance in this way. So I think it's really interesting.
Yes, my easy answer is that I feel limited in my archaeological questions because of my knowledge of the technique. So I limit myself. I limit myself to thinking on problems that can be implemented with my actual knowledge of the tool. And I recognize that is my problem, because probably I don't understand perfectly the tool. So I prefer to reduce my problem in order to be solved by the actual knowledge of the tool. Probably because I don't have a technician able to understand my complicated questions, because I have not yet learned to express my very complex questions into a formal language. So I'm learning now to express easy questions in a formal language. It's a dialectical problem, I think. I'm doing a very small step in advance, and I know that I need much more other steps.
Not necessarily is that you don't know the tool, and the tool could do much more. Because I think that was, I mean, as far as I know about, you are exploiting the global. I mean, the global is that.
Of course,
That's
yes.
not enough. We have to go to the global plus.
Of course, yes, yes. I'm beginning to learn any logic, and I'm beginning to learn different things. And sometimes I find some very, very punctual things that, of course, I can understand. Well, there is a problem using patches instead of continuous space. Well, I can understand perfectly some very small questions of time schedule, of amount of memory. That's not a problem. The main problem is that the social question has so many parameters interrelated that I don't know exactly. It's really interesting, an artificial society with all the complexities we know real societies have, or it's easier, a smaller model, a wrong model, but I can test the results.
Well, I think my perspective is that you are trying to program a Microsoft Office using assembler at this moment. So you need something more in order to be able to program this work. I think. So, and these tools, I think that now are not ready.
Yeah, but I think maybe that's about modeling, not the tools, because the problem is how do you analyze this kind of modeling? I mean, imagine that you can build them. Okay, but how do you analyze the rest with so many parameters and modeling?
Everything is related, of course.
We can leave that.
Yeah, just one. I think we have, as a project, I think we've reached some kind. As for the topics, case studies, clusters, thematic clusters, we've reached a kind of. We have boiled down our case studies to more focused questions, and which cluster in 3 groups. And I think maybe based on, my impression is that and this is on the archaeologist side, is a result of the interaction, of course, but the interest is probably more on our side. And I think if the engineers involved in the project could make an effort maybe to produce something similar, like it goes a bit in the way of the T groups that we have been thinking about. So take the case studies that we have and see if there is 2 or 3 main developments which you think should be in a direction towards which we should put our effort, because obviously there are a lot of different tools that may be developed for specific case studies, but maybe there are 2 or 3 that you have the impression that could be the most useful in a transversal way to most case studies. And maybe this could be another way of clustering our efforts more, less on the archaeological side and more. I don't know if I'm saying something that makes sense from your side or not.
Okay, I think we are gonna leave it here. Unless you, okay. Well, we can continue after, but if we wanna have save the half an hour that we saved, just close it here. I wanna thank our external reviewers for their insightful comments, and let me just wrap up the 2 or 3 ideas that I took from this discussion. One, I mean, there was a big shopping list that I'm not going to repeat, but I thought that was very insightful for each specific case study. So, because it's someone from outside who look at your work and say, okay, I mean, it's nice, but maybe you should think. And I think every case study should take from there whatever they think it's feasible, no? The other thing I think we should take from this is all this discussion about strategies for communication that was also brought up. So we have many things, many messages from modeling, from technology, from archaeology theory. So, okay, what are the best strategies? And I think that's relevant to start thinking of this now, because we still are working on the results. We are still not going outside to the world, but when we start doing so, just do it in a more appropriate way to be effective. And then the other issue that I thought it was interesting is how this dialogue between the modeling and computing part and the archaeology. So we see that there is some progress that has been done on that, but we also see that there is room for keeping the dialogue, for simplifying our questions to make them really workable in the machine, but also for doing new models where we add context to the agent, where we add new challenges and do the same. So I think that's also something we should keep in our minds. And then finally, the last issue of like how we start thinking on this convergence, or even in the need to converge, or to what point only in the best practice for modeling, or we also want to converge with some more theoretical issues within each cluster, as Bernardo was saying. No? So I mean, I think these are, or for me, these are the issues I took for the conversation. For the conversation now. And I think we leave it here. We have the break,
The break with the coffee.
The
Yes.
coffee, and after.
And then I will wrap up and say thanks to all of you, and then we will have Charlie French talk. Okay.
Thank you.
Remind us where we are, and I see that there is in there a word that has created a lot of discussion, a lot of controversy in a sense, the convergence phase. We still have time to reach that level, but I think that we also have an idea of now what we mean with that. Now, what is happening in the near future? The first important point will be between mid-October and mid-November, a meeting of the scientific committee. Out of this workshop should come decision on how to deal with the next step, what to do, where to push things that are not running in time according to the timetable, where to do changes if needed, and things like that. So next week, I will send out, actually Alejandro will send out a mail to all the PIs with a doodle calendar to sort out when we can get together and where and when we can discuss this point. Absolutely important, the 31st of January 2013. We say goodbye to Mark. Thank you very much, and for all the feedback till now, and really very useful, very important, I think, for all of us. And so have a nice journey back, and hope to see you soon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for a fantastic time. It's been really interesting. Thank you for feeding me, watering me.
Bye-bye. So I was saying that the end of January, 31st of January, very important. There is no flexibility with this milestone. We need to have the paper ready, okay? There is no, oh my goodness, I'm running late. I say it and it will be like this. Who's not there by that moment will be left out. Because the agreement we have with the journal is to have a certain calendar, a certain submission date, and a certain production date. So it's not in our hand to delay things, okay? So the next months are very important to pin down, what we've been discussed during these 2 days, playing a little bit more with our modeling and simulation, especially with the simulation, and construct the first result from our case studies. And this is an important point because it will be a kind of a reality check from where then we can start again. By the end of February, like last year happened the same, by the end of February there will be the second year report, including the external reviewers' feedback. Now, I put in bracket pending ministry confirmation because we are in a situation that is a little bit strange. We haven't submitted, for the time being, the last year report because the ministry shut down the web page through which you have to do the submissions, and they didn't say anything but you will have some information at a certain point. And we check regularly the page for the submission, and for the time being, nothing happened. So honestly, and contacting the ministry directly, the answer is, oh, yeah, we are going to contact you. Fine. So, but let's keep, in any case, the normal schedule. And worst case scenario is that our report will pile up in a corner, and when they reopen the thing, we'll be ready to be sent. In April, we will get together again, at least the executive committee, if needed also the scientific committee. That will see it in depending also on the first meeting we have in October, mid-November. And another point that is quite important that didn't come out very much, it was a suggestion, but a suggestion that I see it as something that has to happen in a sense. At a certain point, we will have a lot to discuss in relation to our theme. And that would be, from my perspective, a good moment, not only as we did partially in these 2 days, to discuss it between us, which is already very important, but also the, going out of the box in where we are and start to discussing our result, what we think, with people that have been working on these themes, on this subject already for a certain period of time. So it would be nice to have 3 thematic conferences related to the theme of the cluster, in which the way I will see it, in which is that the people participating are kind of half and half. Half from the cluster, obviously would be open, to anybody from the project that want to participate, but half from the cluster and half from outside, in which we can really start to get, important discussion on our subject. And as always, keep informed, keep in touch. We are in many different institutions, in different cities. It's not easy to be always interconnected on what we do, how we do. But there are, as I say also at the beginning, ways to do it. There is a newsletter and the general SimulPast webpage. There is an email through which information can be gathered. The email is always checked, but by at least 2 people. So it's, there will always be somebody reading what you send. And then please add in the repository all your, in that repository there are information related to the project, but also it would be very nice to have whatever is produced through the project to go into the repository. And that will help us a lot, for instance, when we write the report, when we have to deal with this kind of partially bureaucratical, but also, academic issue in which, we will need to say, well, the project has been doing this. And that's the easiest way. It's much easier for everybody, okay? So with this, I think my impression, I feel very positive about these 2 days. I feel very happy about, what happened, our discussion, the result that we've been showing. It is true that not everything is running maybe at the top of my wish, but I think that that's always the case for several reasons. Maybe sometimes the wishes are too high, or maybe because, it's the way it is. Reality is not always that perfect. But I think that the important thing is that we realize that the project is working, is making step forward. And then thanks to all of you, because I know that we all have a lot of other things to do apart from the project, and cutting out time and energy for the project is not always easy. And also, I want to specifically thank, one of the three has run away already, but I want to specifically thank the external reviewers, because in a sense, what we are doing is our own interest, it's our project, but the external reviewers are doing this out of sympathy for the project. So thank you very much, because your time and your energy are definitely appreciated. And in that sense, it's a great help for us. And with this, thanks to all of you, and we'll get together to the next workshop. Thanks a lot. And now we have, Charlie French that will give us some archaeological for everybody, some archaeology for everybody.